The emergency room doctor stared at the X-ray images on his computer screen, his expression growing more serious by the second. "Miss Wilson," he said slowly, "you have 3 separate fractures in your ankle. How long did you say you've been walking on this?" 2 weeks, I whispered, the words barely audible as reality crashed down on me like a freight train. "I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." He looked up from the screen, genuine concern etched across his face. 2 weeks? With 3 fractures? That must have been excruciating. Why didn't you come in sooner? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. How do you explain to a stranger that the people who were supposed to care about you most had convinced you that your pain didn't matter? How do you put into words the crushing weight of being dismissed, ignored, and made to feel like a burden when you were genuinely suffering? It was a Tuesday evening in late September when everything changed. I remember because I had been looking forward to getting home after a particularly brutal shift at Morrison's Electronics, the retail store, where I'd been working part-time while finishing my nursing degree at Denver Community College. The autumn air in Colorado had that crisp bite to it that made you want to hurry inside, and I was practically jogging across the parking lot to my beat-up Honda Civic. The parking lot behind our apartment complex on Maple Street had been a problem for months. The landlord, Mr. Henderson, had been promising to fix the massive potholes and uneven asphalt since spring. But like most of his promises, it remained just words. Tenants had complained repeatedly about the hazardous conditions, especially after dark when the single flickering streetlight barely illuminated the worst sections. I had navigated that treacherous parking lot hundreds of times before, but that particular evening, my luck ran out. My phone had been buzzing insistently in my pocket, probably my roommate Jessica asking me to pick up milk on the way home. And I made the fatal mistake of trying to fish it out while walking. In that split second of distraction, my right foot found the edge of a pothole I hadn't seen coming. The fall happened in slow motion, the way traumatic moments often do. I felt my ankle twist at an unnatural angle as my foot disappeared into the hole, heard the sickening pop that would haunt my dreams for weeks to come, and then felt my entire body weight come crashing down. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot explosion that shot up my leg and made me cry out into the empty night. For several minutes, I lay there on the cold asphalt, clutching my ankle and trying to process what had just happened. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. When I finally managed to look down at my foot, I could see it was already beginning to swell, and something about the angle looked fundamentally wrong. Getting to my car was a nightmare. I had to crawl part of the way, dragging my injured leg behind me, stopping every few feet as waves of nausea washed over me. By the time I managed to pull myself into the driver's seat, tears were streaming down my face, and I was genuinely questioning whether I could make it home safely. The drive back to the house where I lived with my family was only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every bump in the road sent fresh shock waves of pain through my ankle, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had to pull over twice just to collect myself and fight back the waves of dizziness that kept threatening to overwhelm me. When I finally limped through the front door of our modest 2-story home, my father, Robert Wilson, was in his usual spot on the living room couch, watching ESPN with a beer in his hand. Dad had always been a no-nonsense kind of man, a former construction worker who believed that most of life's problems could be solved with hard work and determination. At 52, he still carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer willpower. "Dad?" I gasped, hobbling into the room with one hand pressed against the wall for support. "I think I really hurt my ankle. I fell in the parking lot at work, and something's definitely wrong." He barely looked up from the television screen, where highlights from a football game were playing. "You probably just twisted it a little," he said dismissively. taking another sip of his Coors Light. "Put some ice on it and walk it off. You'll be fine by morning." The casual dismissal hit me almost as hard as the physical pain. This was my father, the man who was supposed to protect me and take care of me, and he couldn't even be bothered to look at my injury. But I pressed on, hoping that if I could make him understand the severity of the situation, he would take me seriously. "Dad, I really think this is more than just a twist," I insisted, my voice cracking with desperation. "I heard something pop when I fell, and I can barely put any weight on it. Look at how swollen it is already." Finally, he turned his attention away from the TV, but his expression was one of annoyance rather than concern. "Stephanie, you're 23 years old. You don't need to come running to Daddy every time you get a little bump or bruise. Toughen up a little, would you?" His words stung worse than the physical pain. I stood there in the doorway, balancing on one foot and fighting back tears, while my own father acted like I was being dramatic about something that felt genuinely serious. The dismissal was so complete, so final, that I found myself questioning my own perception of the situation. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really was just a minor injury that would heal on its own. My mother, Linda Wilson, emerged from the kitchen where she had been preparing dinner, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Mom had always been the more nurturing parent, the one who kissed scraped knees and stayed up all night when we were sick as children. I felt a surge of hope that she would see what Dad was missing, that this was something that needed medical attention. "What's all the commotion about?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was more irritated by the interruption to her evening routine than genuinely concerned about my welfare. "Stephanie took a little tumble at work," Dad explained before I could speak for myself. "She's making a big production out of it, as usual." The phrase "as usual" cut deep. It wasn't true. I had never been the type to seek attention or make mountains out of molehills. If anything, I had always been the responsible one in the family, the one who took care of everyone else's problems while quietly dealing with my own. But somehow, in that moment, my father had managed to rewrite history and paint me as a drama queen. Mom glanced at my ankle, but her assessment was just as superficial as Dad's had been. "It does look a little puffy," she admitted, "but I'm sure it's nothing that won't heal up on its own. We don't need to waste money on an emergency room visit for a sprained ankle." The mention of money hit a nerve that ran deep in our family. The Wilsons had never been wealthy, and medical expenses had always been viewed as unnecessary luxuries rather than essential health care. Dad's construction job provided basic insurance, but the deductibles and co-pays were still a significant burden for a family already struggling to make ends meet. I understood the financial pressure, but I also knew that something was seriously wrong with my ankle. "I could just go to the urgent care clinic," I suggested desperately. "It would be cheaper than the ER, and they could at least take a look at it." Dad's expression hardened. "You're not going anywhere except upstairs to bed. Put some ice on it. Take a couple of ibuprofen, and stop being such a baby about it. I've broken bones before, and I didn't go crying to the doctor every time something hurt." The comparison to his own experiences was typical Dad. He had a tendency to measure everyone else's pain against his own, as if suffering were some kind of competition where only the toughest person's discomfort mattered. It was a worldview that left no room for vulnerability or the possibility that different people might have different pain tolerances or healing needs. My younger brother Marcus, who was 19 and home from his first semester at Colorado State University, had been listening to the conversation from the top of the stairs. Unlike our parents, he seemed genuinely concerned about my condition, and he came down to get a closer look at my ankle. "Steph, that looks pretty bad," he said quietly, crouching down to examine my foot. "Are you sure you don't want to get it checked out?" For a brief moment, I felt validated. Someone in my family was actually seeing what I was seeing. But before I could respond, Dad's voice boomed across the room with an authority that brooked no argument. "Marcus, don't encourage your sister's dramatics. "She's fine. This conversation is over." And just like that, it was. The family had spoken, the verdict had been rendered, and I was left to deal with my injury alone. As I hobbled upstairs to my bedroom, each step sending fresh waves of agony through my ankle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my family. The people who were supposed to care about me most had looked at my pain and decided it wasn't worth their time or attention. That night, as I lay in bed with a bag of frozen peas pressed against my swollen ankle, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was losing my mind. The pain was constant and severe, making it impossible to find a comfortable position or get any real sleep. Every time I moved, even slightly, it felt like someone was driving a red-hot nail through my joint. But my family's reaction had planted seeds of doubt that were almost as painful as the physical injury itself. Maybe I was being overdramatic. Maybe this was just what a sprained ankle felt like, and I was simply too weak or inexperienced to handle it properly. Maybe Dad was right, and I needed to toughen up and stop running to other people every time life got a little difficult. These thoughts swirled through my mind as the hours crawled by, mixing with the steady throb of pain to create a perfect storm of physical and emotional anguish. By the time dawn broke over Denver, I had made a decision that would haunt me for the next 2 weeks. I was going to prove to my family that I was tough enough to handle this on my own, no matter what it cost me. The next morning brought no relief, only a new kind of hell. My ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size overnight, taking on a disturbing purplish-black color that reminded me of an overripe eggplant. The skin was stretched so tight it looked like it might split open at any moment, and the pain had evolved from the sharp stabbing sensation of the previous night into a deep, constant ache that seemed to penetrate straight through to the bone. Getting out of bed was an exercise in pure determination. I had to use my dresser and the wall to pull myself upright, and even then, the slightest pressure on my right foot sent lightning bolts of agony shooting up my leg. But I had made a commitment to myself. I was going to prove that I could handle this without running to the doctor like some kind of weakling. The real test came when I tried to get ready for my morning classes at Denver Community College. I had 3 lectures scheduled that day, including advanced anatomy and physiology. Ironically, the very class that was teaching me about bone structure and healing processes. Missing school wasn't an option. I was already behind on my student loan payments, and I couldn't afford to fall behind academically. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Getting dressed became a strategic operation that took nearly an hour. I had to sit on the edge of my bed and carefully maneuver my injured foot into my sneaker, a process that left me sweating and nauseated from the pain. Tying the laces was impossible with the swelling, so I left them loose and hoped my shoe wouldn't fall off during the day. The stairs presented their own unique challenge. Our house had 15 steps from the second floor to the main level, and each one felt like a mountain to climb. I ended up scooting down backwards on my bottom, like a toddler, while gripping the banister with both hands. It was humiliating, but it was better than the alternative of tumbling headfirst down the staircase. In the kitchen, Mom was packing lunch for Marcus, who was heading back to campus after spending the night at home. She glanced up when I finally made my appearance, nearly 30 minutes later than usual, and I caught a flicker of concern across her face when she saw how I was moving. "Honey, you look awful," she said, setting down the sandwich she was making. "Maybe you should stay home from school today and rest." For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe she was starting to understand the severity of my condition. Maybe this was the opening I needed to convince someone in my family that I required medical attention. But before I could respond, Dad's voice cut through the moment like a buzzsaw. "Absolutely not," he declared from his position at the kitchen table, where he was reading the Denver Post and drinking his morning coffee. She's not going to use a minor injury as an excuse to skip school. We're not raising any quitters in this house. The word quitter hit me like a physical blow. In Dad's vocabulary, there was no worse label you could apply to someone. It was the ultimate insult, reserved for people who gave up when things got tough, who took the easy way out instead of pushing through adversity. Being called a quitter was essentially being told you had no character, no backbone, no worth as a human being. "Robert, look at her ankle," Mom said, making a tentative attempt to advocate for me. "It's really quite swollen." Dad barely glanced in my direction before dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "It's supposed to swell. That's how the body heals itself. She'll be fine once she gets moving and works the stiffness out." His confidence in his own medical expertise was staggering, especially considering his complete lack of any healthcare training. But Dad had always possessed an unwavering belief in his own opinions, particularly when it came to matters of toughness and resilience. In his worldview, the human body was like a machine that could be fixed through willpower and determination alone. The drive to school was a nightmare that nearly convinced me to turn around and go home. My right foot was essentially useless for driving, so I had to rely entirely on my left foot for both the gas and brake pedals. This made for jerky, unpredictable driving that earned me several angry honks from other motorists on Colfax Avenue. But the physical challenges of getting to school were nothing compared to the actual experience of trying to navigate campus with a severely injured ankle. Denver Community College was spread across several buildings connected by outdoor walkways, and my first class was on the third floor of the science building. Naturally, the one building on campus without a working elevator. By the time I reached my advanced anatomy classroom, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool October morning, and my face must have been pale as a ghost. Several of my classmates noticed my obvious distress and offered to help, but I declined their assistance with what I hoped was a convincing smile. The last thing I needed was for word to get back to my family that I was making a spectacle of myself on campus. Professor Martinez, a former emergency room nurse who had transitioned into teaching, was in the middle of a lecture about fracture types when I limped through the door 15 minutes late. She paused mid-sentence and looked at me with obvious concern. "Miss Wilson, are you all right? You look like you're in considerable pain." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in a class about bone injuries while suffering from what I was increasingly convinced was exactly that kind of injury. But admitting weakness in front of my peers felt impossible, especially when I could practically hear Dad's voice in my head calling me a quitter. "I'm fine, Professor Martinez," I lied through gritted teeth. "Just a minor ankle sprain. Nothing serious." She didn't look convinced, but she continued with her lecture. As fate would have it, the topic for that day was ankle fractures and the importance of immediate medical intervention. Professor Martinez showed X-ray images of various types of ankle breaks, explaining how untreated fractures could lead to permanent damage, chronic pain, and long-term mobility issues. "The most important thing to remember," she emphasized, clicking to a slide showing a severely displaced fracture, "is that ankle injuries should never be ignored or dismissed as minor. The ankle joint is incredibly complex, with multiple bones, ligaments, and tendons working together. Even what appears to be a simple sprain can mask serious underlying damage." Every word felt like it was being directed specifically at me. I found myself staring at the X-ray images on the projection screen, comparing them to what I imagined might be happening inside my own ankle. The similarities were unsettling, to say the least. During the break between lectures, my friend and study partner Ashley Chen approached me with genuine concern written all over her face. Ashley was one of those naturally empathetic people who seemed to have a sixth sense for when others were suffering, and she had clearly picked up on my distress. "Stephanie, what happened to your ankle?" "You can barely walk," she said, her voice filled with the kind of caring that I desperately wished I was hearing from my own family. "It's nothing serious," I replied automatically, the lie feeling more hollow each time I repeated it. Just took a little tumble in a parking lot. It'll be fine in a day or two. Ashley wasn't buying it for a second. Have you seen a doctor? That swelling doesn't look normal at all. The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I considered telling her the truth. About the fall, about the pain, about my family's dismissive reaction. But admitting that my own parents didn't think my injury was worth medical attention felt like acknowledging some fundamental failure on my part. I don't need a doctor for a sprained ankle, I said instead, forcing what I hoped was a confident smile. I'm tougher than I look. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of pain and determination. I managed to make it through my Psychology of Human Development class, though I spent most of the lecture period trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on my ankle. My final class, Pharmacology, was mercifully held in a ground floor classroom, but by the time it ended, I was running purely on adrenaline and stubbornness. The walk back to my car felt like an epic journey across a hostile landscape. Every step was a conscious decision to keep going, to not give in to the weakness that Dad had warned me about. Other students passed by, most of them too absorbed in their own lives to notice my struggle. But occasionally, someone would ask if I needed help or if I was okay. Each time I gave them the same response, just a minor sprain, I'll be fine. The drive home was even more treacherous than the morning commute. The pain in my ankle had intensified throughout the day, and I was starting to experience moments of dizziness that made me question whether I should be behind the wheel of a car. But the alternative, calling my family for help, was unthinkable. When I finally made it home, Dad was in the garage working on his truck, and Mom was in the living room folding laundry. Neither of them asked about my day or showed any interest in how I was feeling. It was as if the previous night's conversation had never happened, as if my injury had been filed away in some mental category labeled resolved. That evening, as I sat in my bedroom with my ankle propped up on pillows and wrapped in ice, I began to seriously question my decision to tough this out alone. The pain was getting worse rather than better, and the swelling seemed to be spreading up my leg. But every time I considered approaching my parents about seeking medical attention, I could hear Dad's voice calling me a quitter, a drama queen, someone who couldn't handle life's minor bumps and bruises. The internal conflict was almost as exhausting as the physical pain. Part of me knew, with the clinical certainty of my nursing education, that something was seriously wrong. But another, part of me, the part that had been shaped by years of family dynamics and expectations, insisted that I was being weak and overdramatic. As I lay in bed that second night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of my family going about their normal routines downstairs, I made a decision that would define the next 2 weeks of my life. I was going to prove once and for all that I was tough enough to handle whatever life threw at me, even if it killed me. By the 4th day, my ankle had transformed into something that barely resembled a human body part. The swelling had spread from my foot all the way up to mid-calf, creating a grotesque, shapeless mass that looked more like an inflated balloon than a leg. The skin had taken on a mottled appearance, deep purples mixed with sickly yellows, and greens that suggested internal bleeding and tissue damage on a scale I didn't want to contemplate. But I had committed to this path of proving my toughness, and Thursday meant returning to my part-time job at Morrison's Electronics. The retail store was located in a busy shopping plaza on the south side of Denver, and my shift manager, Carol Henderson, had already called twice asking if I was planning to show up for my scheduled hours. With my student loan payment due next, week and rent always looming, missing work wasn't financially feasible. Getting dressed for work required strategic planning that would have impressed a military tactician. I had given up on normal shoes entirely. Even my loosest sneakers couldn't accommodate the massive swelling. Instead, I had to wear one of Dad's old work boots on my injured foot, leaving the laces completely undone and stuffing the extra space with socks to prevent my foot from sliding around inside. The drive to Morrison's became an exercise in creative problem-solving. I had fashioned a makeshift driving setup using a small pillow to elevate my right foot and a wooden ruler taped to my shoe to help me reach the pedals. It was dangerous, uncomfortable, and probably illegal, but it was the only way I could maintain my independence and continue working. Morrison's Electronics was one of those big box stores that seemed designed to torture anyone with mobility issues. The employee parking was located at the far end of the lot, requiring a trek across what felt like miles of asphalt. The store itself was massive, with wide aisles that stretched from the front entrance all the way to the storage areas in the back. On a normal day, employees could easily walk 5 or 6 miles during a single shift, moving between the sales floor, stockroom, and customer service areas. Carol was waiting for me when I finally limped through the employee entrance, nearly 20 minutes late and already exhausted from the journey. Carol was a woman in her early 40s who had worked her way up from cashier to shift manager through sheer determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of consumer electronics. She prided herself on running a tight ship and had little patience for excuses or what she perceived as laziness. "Wilson, you look like hell," she said bluntly, looking me up and down with undisguised concern. "What happened to your leg?" "Minor ankle sprain," I replied, using the same lie that had become my default response. "I'll be fine. Just need to take it easy today." Carol's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but the store was already busy with early morning customers and she needed all hands on deck. "All right, but I'm putting you on register duty instead of floor coverage. You won't have to do as much walking that way." I felt a wave of gratitude toward Carol that was almost overwhelming. Here was someone who barely knew me, yet she was showing more practical concern for my well-being than my own family had managed to muster. The kindness was so unexpected that I had to blink back tears as I made my way to the checkout area. Register duty at Morrison's was typically considered the easy assignment. You stood in one place, scanned items, processed payments, and occasionally dealt with customer complaints. But what I hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to stand on my injured ankle for hours at a time. The concrete floors offered no cushioning, and the anti-fatigue mats provided to employees were worn, thin from years of use. Within the first hour, waves of nausea were washing over me with increasing frequency. The constant pressure on my ankle was creating a feedback loop of pain that seemed to intensify with each passing minute. I found myself gripping the counter with white knuckles, using it as much for support as for balance. My first real test came when a customer approached with a cart full of computer equipment, monitors, towers, keyboards, and accessories that needed to be carefully handled and properly bagged. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a routine transaction. But reaching across the counter to scan heavy items while balancing on one foot turned into a precarious balancing act. "Excuse me, miss, are you all right?" asked the customer, a middle-aged man in a business suit who was watching my struggle with obvious concern. "You look like you're in a lot of pain." "I'm fine, sir," I managed through gritted teeth, forcing what I hoped was a professional smile. "Just a small injury, nothing to worry about." But as I leaned forward to scan a particularly heavy monitor, my injured ankle buckled completely. I felt myself starting to fall, and only managed to catch myself by grabbing the edge of the counter with both hands. The movement sent such an intense wave of pain through my leg that I actually cried out, a sharp gasp that I couldn't suppress. The customer's concern immediately shifted into alarm. "That's not fine at all. You need to sit down. Should I call someone?" Before I could respond, Carol appeared at my shoulder, having noticed the commotion from across the store. She took one look at my face, which I'm sure had gone completely white, and made an executive decision. "Wilson, take your break. Now, go to the employee lounge and put your foot up." "Carol, I don't need a break," I protested weakly. "I can handle this. I'm not a quitter." The phrase slipped out before I could stop it, and I realized with horror that I was now parroting Dad's language even to my supervisor. Carol's expression softened with understanding, as if she recognized something in my desperate need to prove myself. "This isn't about being tough or being a quitter," she said gently. "This is about being smart. You're no good to me if you collapse. On the sales floor. Go rest for 15 minutes and that's an order." The employee break room at Morrison's was a depressing little space with flickering fluorescent lights, mismatched furniture, and the lingering smell of microwaved lunches. But it had a couch, and being able to finally take the weight off my ankle felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. I propped my injured foot up on the coffee table and closed my eyes, trying to block out the constant throb of pain. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica, my roommate, who was wondering if I'd be home for dinner. Jessica Martinez was a graduate student in social work at the University of Colorado, Denver, and we'd been roommates for almost 2 years. She was one of those naturally intuitive people who could sense when something was wrong, and I'd been working hard to keep my injury hidden from her as well. "Working late tonight," I texted back. "Don't wait up." It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have to work late to make up for the extra breaks I was taking. But the real reason I didn't want to go home was that I was becoming increasingly afraid of what Jessica might say if she saw the current state of my ankle. Her social work training had taught her to recognize signs of neglect and abuse, and I wasn't sure I could handle having someone else question my family's response to my injury. When I returned to my register after the break, the pain had subsided, from excruciating to merely unbearable. I made it through the next few hours by developing a system of shifting my weight from foot to foot, leaning heavily on the counter, and taking micro breaks whenever possible. Several more customers commented on my obvious distress, but I had perfected my response by now. Minor sprain, healing nicely, nothing to worry about. The real crisis came during the afternoon rush, when a particularly demanding customer decided that none of the laptop computers on display met his specifications. He insisted that I personally walk him through the entire electronics section, comparing features and prices on dozens of different models. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a routine part of customer service. But in my current condition, it felt like being asked to run a marathon. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm currently assigned to register duty," I explained, hoping to avoid the lengthy trek around the store. "Let me call someone from our computer department to assist you." The customer's face flushed red with indignation. "I don't want to talk to someone else. I want to talk to you. Is customer service not important to this store?" The implied threat was clear. If I didn't provide the service he wanted, he would complain to management. Complaints to management meant negative marks on my employment record, which could jeopardize my job. And losing my job would mean losing my ability to pay for school, rent, and basic necessities. So I abandoned my register and embarked on what felt like an epic journey across the store, explaining laptop specifications while fighting back waves of dizziness and nausea. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to maintain a professional demeanor and provide knowledgeable answers to his endless questions. By the time we reached the high-end gaming laptops in the back corner of the store, I was starting to see spots in my vision. The pain had evolved beyond anything I had previously experienced, becoming a living thing that seemed to consume every aspect of my consciousness. I found myself leaning heavily on the display cases, using them for support while pretending to examine product features. "This one looks promising," the customer said, pointing to a laptop on the top shelf. "Can you get it down so I can see it better?" The laptop he wanted was easily 6 feet off the ground, requiring me to stretch up on my tiptoes to reach it. Under normal circumstances, this would have been challenging, but manageable. In my current condition, it was like asking me to perform an Olympic gymnastics routine. I reached up, balanced precariously on my injured ankle, and managed to grasp the laptop box. But as I tried to lift it down, my ankle gave out completely. I felt myself falling backward, the laptop box slipping from my hands, and for a terrifying moment, I was certain I was going to crash to the ground and potentially injure myself even more severely. Somehow, I managed to catch myself against a nearby display, But the laptop box wasn't so lucky. It hit the floor with a sickening crash, and I could hear something breaking inside the packaging. The customer stared at the damaged box in horror. "What did you just do? That's a $2,000 computer." Before I could explain or apologize, Carol appeared again, drawn by the sound of the crash. She took one look at the scene, me clutching the display case for dear life, the customer red-faced with anger, and the damaged laptop box on the floor. And her expression shifted from concern to decisive action. "Sir, we'll take care of the damaged merchandise," she told the customer firmly. "Wilson, you're done for the day. Go home." "But Carol, my shift isn't over until—" "Go home," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "And Wilson, don't come back until you've seen a doctor about that ankle. I don't care what you call it, sprain, strain, or whatever, but you're not working in this condition anymore." As I gathered my things and prepared for the painful journey home, I realized that my carefully constructed world of denial was starting to crumble around me. First Professor Martinez, then concerned classmates, then customers, and now my supervisor. Everyone who looked at my ankle saw something that I was desperately trying to ignore. But the voice in my head still sounded like Dad, still insisting that seeking medical help would be admitting defeat, giving up, being a quitter. As I limped across the parking lot toward my car, I made yet another decision that would haunt me. I would take a few days off work to let the ankle heal on its own, and then everything would go back to normal. I had no idea that normal was now permanently out of reach. The weekend brought a new kind of prison sentence, being trapped at home with my family while my condition deteriorated in ways that were becoming impossible to hide. Carol's ultimatum about seeing a doctor echoed in my mind, but facing my father's inevitable reaction to such weakness felt more terrifying than continuing to suffer in silence. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that normally would have sent me outside for a run or a hike in the nearby Rockies. Instead, I found myself essentially housebound, unable to navigate the stairs without crawling, and dependent on a makeshift system of crutches I'd fashioned from a pair of old wooden canes I'd found in the basement. The canes had belonged to my late grandfather, Harold Wilson, who had used them during his final years when arthritis made walking difficult. Finding them felt like some kind of cosmic irony. Here I was, a healthy 23-year-old, reduced to using mobility aids that my 80-year-old grandfather had needed. But they were better than nothing, even if they were poorly fitted, for my height and created pressure sores on my hands within hours of use. My attempts to conceal the severity of my condition from Jessica became increasingly elaborate and exhausting. She had returned from a weekend trip to visit her sister in Colorado Springs and immediately noticed that something was different about my behavior. Jessica had always been observant. It was one of the qualities that made her excellent at social work, and my sudden reluctance to leave my bedroom hadn't escaped her attention. "Stephanie, are you feeling okay?" she asked through my bedroom door that Saturday afternoon. "You've been holed up in there all day, and I heard some weird thumping sounds earlier." The thumping sounds had been me falling while trying to get to my dresser, but I couldn't exactly explain that without revealing the extent of my injury. "Just tired from work," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady despite the wave of nausea that had been my constant companion for days now. "I think I might be coming down with something." "Do you need anything? I could make you some soup or run to the pharmacy if you need medicine." Her kindness was almost unbearable. Here was someone offering to take care of me, showing the kind of concern that I desperately wished I was receiving from my own family. But accepting her help would mean explaining why I needed it, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. "I'm fine, Jess, really. Just need to sleep it off." The lie felt heavier each time I told it, but I had committed to this path of independence, and backing down now would mean admitting that Dad had been right to call me weak and dramatic. Downstairs, the normal rhythm of family life continued without me. I could hear the television blaring ESPN, the clink of dishes as Mom prepared meals, and the occasional burst of laughter from Marcus, who was spending his weekend break catching up with high school friends. It was as if my absence from family activities had barely registered, as if I had become invisible in my own home. The isolation was particularly painful during mealtimes. The smell of Mom's cooking would drift up to my room. Saturday's pot, roast, Sunday's pancakes, but navigating the stairs to join the family for dinner felt insurmountable. Instead, I survived on the stash of granola bars and bottled water I kept in my room, telling myself that this was just temporary, that I would rejoin normal life as soon as my ankle healed, but my ankle wasn't healing. If anything, it was getting worse. The swelling had now spread well past my knee, creating a grotesque, shapeless mass that bore no resemblance to a human leg. The skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that was deeply disturbing, and I had begun to notice red streaks radiating upward from the injury site, something that my nursing education told me could indicate a serious infection. The pain had also evolved into something beyond my previous experience. It was no longer just localized to my ankle, but had become a full-body phenomenon that affected everything from my ability to concentrate to my capacity for basic hygiene. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals interrupted by waves of agony that would leave me gasping and covered in cold sweat. By Sunday evening, I was beginning to experience moments of genuine delirium, the combination of constant pain, inadequate nutrition, and sleep deprivation was taking a toll on my cognitive function that was becoming impossible to ignore. I found myself losing track of time, forgetting what day it was, and occasionally hallucinating sounds or movements in my peripheral vision. It was during one of these episodes that Marcus finally confronted me directly. He had been hearing me, moving around upstairs, or more accurately, hearing me fall and struggle to get back up. And his concern had finally overcome his reluctance to defy Dad's prohibition on encouraging my dramatics. "Stephanie, open this door right now," he said, his voice carrying an authority that reminded me he was no longer the little brother I remembered. "I'm not leaving until I see what's going on with you." For a moment, I considered continuing to refuse him access. But the isolation had become almost as unbearable as the physical pain, and the prospect of having someone, anyone, acknowledge what I was going through felt like a lifeline. I crawled to the door and unlocked it, then retreated to my bed before he could see the full extent of my mobility limitations. But when Marcus stepped into my room and got his first clear look at my condition, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Jesus Christ, Stephanie, what the hell happened to your leg?" The shock in his voice was almost validating. There was confirmation that what I was experiencing was as serious as I had feared, that I wasn't being dramatic or weak or oversensitive. "It's just a sprained ankle," I whispered, the lie sounding pathetic even to my own ears. "It's healing, it just takes time." Marcus moved closer to get a better look, and I watched his expression transform from concern to horror to barely controlled anger. "This is not a sprained ankle. This looks like you've been hit by a truck. How long has it been like this?" "About a week," I admitted, and even that was a conservative estimate. "A week? You've been suffering like this for a week and nobody has taken you to a doctor?" The accusation in his voice was directed not at me, but at our parents, and I felt a complicated mix of relief and guilt. Relief that someone was finally seeing the situation clearly, and guilt that I was allowing him to criticize our family. "Dad said I should walk it off," I explained weakly. "He said going to the doctor would be giving up." Marcus sat down heavily, in my desk chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that reminded me of Dad. But unlike Dad, his anger was directed at the situation rather than at me. "Stephanie, Dad's not a doctor. Neither is Mom. They have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to medical stuff. This," he gestured at my leg, "this needs professional attention, like immediately." "I can't," I said, and the words came out as a sob. "If I go to the doctor now, after Dad specifically told me not to, it's like admitting that I'm weak, that I can't handle things on my own. Who cares what Dad thinks? Marcus shot back. Dad's not the one who has to live in this body. Dad's not the one who might end up permanently disabled because he was too stubborn to admit he was wrong. The word disabled hit me like a physical blow. In all my nursing classes, I had learned about the long-term consequences of untreated injuries, but I had somehow managed to avoid applying that knowledge to my own situation. The possibility that my insistence on proving my toughness might result in permanent damage was a reality I had been desperately trying to avoid confronting. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words coming out in a whisper. "I'm scared that it's too late. I'm scared that I've already damaged something permanently, and I'm scared of what Dad will say if I admit that he was wrong." Marcus leaned forward, his expression softening with understanding. "Steph, you know what's really weak? Letting fear make your decisions for you. You know what's really giving up? Accepting permanent damage because you're too afraid to admit you need help?" His words hit with the force of revelation. All this time, I had been thinking of seeking medical attention as a sign of weakness, when in reality, continuing to suffer in silence was the weak choice. Standing up to Dad's expectations and advocating for my own health would actually require more courage than I had ever needed before. "Will you come with me?" I asked, the question surprising both of us. "To the hospital, I mean. I don't think I can face this alone." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Of course, but we need to go now, tonight. This can't wait until tomorrow." As we began planning our clandestine trip to the emergency room, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in over a week, I was taking action instead of simply enduring. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, and I had no idea that the worst revelations were still ahead of us. The drive to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital would change everything, but in that moment, all I could focus on was the overwhelming relief of finally admitting that I needed help. The voice in my head that sounded like Dad was still there, still calling me a quitter, but for the first time, I found the strength to tell it to shut up. The plan to get me to the hospital required the kind of covert operation typically reserved for espionage films. It was nearly 11 p.m. on Sunday night, and the house had finally settled into its usual evening quiet. Dad was asleep in his recliner with the television still playing highlights from the Broncos game. Mom had gone to bed with a romance novel, and Jessica was in her room presumably studying for midterm exams. Marcus had spent the past 2 hours researching emergency rooms on his phone, trying to find one that would be both accessible and discreet. Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital was only 15 minutes away, but more importantly, it was far enough from our neighborhood that we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. The last thing we needed was for word to get back to Dad that his children had defied his medical judgment. Getting me down the stairs without waking anyone required mathematical precision and physical endurance that tested both our limits. Marcus had found a thick comforter that we could use as a makeshift stretcher, allowing him to essentially drag me down the steps one at a time while I bit down on a washcloth to muffle any sounds of pain. Each bump sent shockwaves through my entire body, but the prospect of finally getting real medical attention gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. By the time we reached the bottom of the stairs, both of us were drenched in sweat, despite the cool October night, and I was fighting back tears of both agony and relief. The hardest part was getting from the house to Marcus's Honda Accord without attracting attention. Our neighborhood was quiet, but porch lights and street lamps created pools of visibility that we needed to avoid. Marcus had backed his car up to our driveway, minimizing the distance I would need to travel. But even that short journey felt like crossing a minefield. "I'm going to carry you," he whispered as we huddled by the front door. "It'll be faster and quieter than trying to help you walk." Under normal circumstances, the idea of my younger brother carrying me would have been laughable. I was taller than him by several inches and had always prided myself on my independence. But desperation had stripped away most of my ego, and I was grateful for any solution that would get me medical help. Marcus was stronger than I had realized, probably from his freshman year of college athletics, but carrying a full-grown adult across a driveway still pushed him to his limits. I wrapped my arms around his neck and tried to make myself as light as possible, while he struggled to maintain balance on the uneven pavement. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was essentially the opposite of Dad's walk-it-off philosophy. Here I was, being literally carried to get help. The drive to the hospital was surreal in its contrast to my previous solo trips. For over a week, I had been isolated with my pain, convinced that I was experiencing something that nobody else could understand or validate. But having Marcus in the driver's seat, occasionally glancing over at me with genuine concern, made me realize how starved I had been for basic human compassion. "You know this isn't your fault, right?" he said as we pulled into the hospital parking lot. "I mean, the injury was an accident, but everything that happened after, that's on Mom and Dad, not you." The statement hung between us like a revelation. For 10 days, I had been carrying the weight of guilt along with the physical pain, convinced that my suffering was somehow a personal failing. The idea that my family might bear responsibility for my deteriorating condition was something I had been afraid to even consider. Presbyterian St. Joseph's emergency room at midnight on a Sunday was a study in controlled chaos. The waiting area was populated with the usual mix of genuine emergencies and people who probably could have waited until morning. Crying children with fevers, adults nursing obviously broken bones, and a few individuals who appeared to be dealing with mental health crises. The triage nurse who first assessed my condition was a woman in her 50s named Janet Rodriguez, whose expression shifted from routine professionalism to alarmed concern the moment she saw my ankle. She had the kind of clinical competence that came from decades of emergency medicine, and her reaction told me everything I needed to know about the severity of my situation. "How long ago did this injury occur?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral as she made notes on her clipboard. "About 10 days, I admitted, watching her eyebrows rise incrementally with each word. 10 days? She repeated. "And you're just seeking treatment now?" The question felt like an accusation, and I found myself scrambling to explain the complicated family dynamics that had led to this delay. "But how do you tell a medical professional that your father had forbidden you from seeking healthcare because he considered it a sign of weakness?" "I thought it was just a sprain," I said weakly. "My family thought it would heal on its own." Janet's expression suggested that she had heard similar stories before, and none of them had ended well. "Honey, I need to get you into a room immediately." This level of swelling and discoloration suggests complications that require urgent attention. The word complications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. In my nursing classes, complications were the things that turned minor injuries into major medical disasters. They were what happened when people ignored warning signs, delayed treatment, or made poor decisions about their health care. Within minutes, I was in a wheelchair being rushed through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who wasn't a medical professional. Marcus jogged alongside, trying to keep up while holding both our phones and my makeshift crutches. The speed of our movement suggested an urgency that made my stomach clench with fear. The examination room was stark and clinical, with the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like a corpse. As Janet helped transfer me from the wheelchair to the examination table, the full extent of my condition became visible under the unforgiving hospital lights. What I had been trying to hide for over a week was now completely exposed to professional scrutiny. "Dr. Williams will be with you in just a moment," Janet said, her voice carrying the kind of forced optimism that healthcare workers use when they're trying not to alarm patients. "He's going to want to order some imaging studies right away." The phrase imaging studies meant X-rays, and X-rays would reveal whatever damage I had been doing to my ankle by continuing to walk on it for 10 days. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I was going to get definitive answers about what was wrong with me. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Dr. Michael Williams arrived 15 minutes later, and his reaction to my condition was even more pronounced than the nurses had been. He was a man in his early 40s with graying temples and the kind of confident bearing that suggested extensive emergency medicine experience. But when he saw my ankle, his professional composure cracked just enough for me to see genuine alarm in his eyes. "Miss Wilson, I'm Dr. Williams. Can you tell me exactly what happened when you initially injured your ankle?" I recounted the parking lot fall, the immediate pain, and the sound of something popping inside my joint. Dr. Williams listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes, but his expression grew increasingly serious as my story progressed. "And after the initial injury, how much weight have you been bearing on this ankle?" "I've been walking on it," I admitted. "Going to school, working retail shifts, normal activities. My family said I should walk it off." Dr. Williams set down his pen and looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of professional concern and barely controlled frustration. "Miss Wilson, I need you to understand something. Based on what I'm seeing here, you should not have been walking on this ankle at all. Not for 10 minutes, let alone 10 days. The words hit me like a physical blow. All the pain I had endured, all the struggle to prove my toughness, all the determination to avoid being seen as weak. It had all been not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. "We need to get X-rays immediately," Dr. Williams continued. "But I'm going to be honest with you. I'm very concerned about what we're going to find. The level of swelling and discoloration suggests that there may be significant bone damage, and the red streaking indicates a possible infection that could be serious." As the radiology technician prepared to wheel me down for X-rays, I caught Marcus's eye across the room. He looked as shaken as I felt, probably realizing that our midnight hospital run might be revealing damage that could have been prevented if we had acted sooner. The X-ray machine was a massive, intimidating piece of equipment that seemed designed to reveal secrets that bodies tried to keep hidden. As the technician positioned my ankle and warned me to hold perfectly still, I found myself holding my breath not just to avoid movement, but in anticipation of finally learning the truth about what I had done to myself. The images would tell a story that would change everything we thought we knew about my injury, my family's judgment, and the price of proving toughness at any cost. But at that moment, all I could do was wait for the machine to capture the evidence of 10 days' worth of damage that should never have been allowed to occur. The radiology department at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital felt like a sterile purgatory, where patients waited to learn their medical fate. After the X-ray technician finished capturing images from multiple angles, Marcus and I were left alone in the small waiting area adjacent to the examination rooms. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken fears about what those images might reveal. 23 minutes felt like 23 hours. Marcus kept checking his phone, probably calculating how long we could stay at the hospital before our absence was noticed at home. I sat in the wheelchair, staring at my grotesquely swollen ankle and trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever verdict was coming. The rational part of my brain, the part educated in anatomy and physiology, knew that 10 days of walking on a serious injury had likely caused significant damage, but the emotional part of me was still clinging to hope that maybe, somehow, it wasn't as bad as it looked. When Dr. Williams finally returned, he was carrying a tablet displaying my X-ray images, and his expression had shifted from concerned to grave. He pulled up a chair directly in front of me, the kind of positioning that healthcare providers use when they need to deliver serious news that requires their full attention and compassion. "Miss Wilson, I've reviewed your X-rays with our orthopedic consultant, and I need to share some very concerning findings with you." The formal tone in his voice made my stomach drop. This wasn't going to be a minor fracture that would heal with a few weeks in a cast. This was something much worse. Dr. Williams turned the tablet toward me, and for the first time, I saw the internal reality of what I had been putting my body through for the past 10 days. The X-ray images were shocking in their clarity, Stark black and white evidence of damage that was far more extensive than I had allowed myself to imagine. "You have 3 separate fractures in your ankle," he said, using a pen to point out the damage on the screen. "Here, here, and here. This is a complex injury that would have been serious even with immediate treatment. But walking on it for 10 days has created complications that we're going to need to address very carefully. 3 fractures." The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. Not a sprain, not a minor injury that would heal with rest and ice, but 3 actual breaks in the bones that were supposed to support my entire body weight. I stared at the X-ray images, trying to process the visible evidence of my body's destruction. "The most concerning issue," Dr. Williams continued, "is that continued weight-bearing has caused displacement of the bone fragments. What might have been treatable with casting and immobilization now requires surgical intervention. Surgery." The word hit me like a physical blow. In my medical training, I had learned that ankle surgeries were complex procedures with long recovery times and potential complications. The idea that my stubborn insistence on proving my toughness had escalated a treatable injury into something requiring surgical repair was devastating. "Additionally," Dr. Williams said, his voice becoming even more serious, "the red streaking we observed suggests that you've developed a bone infection, osteomyelitis. This is a serious complication that occurs when bacteria enter fractured bone tissue. Left untreated, it can spread to other parts of your body and become life-threatening." Life-threatening. The phrase hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. What had started as a simple fall in a parking lot had somehow evolved into a medical emergency that could potentially kill me. The irony was so complete it was almost laughable. In my determination to avoid appearing weak, I had nearly destroyed my ankle and potentially endangered my life. Marcus was staring at the X-ray images with an expression of horror that probably matched my own. How bad is the infection?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll need to run blood tests to determine the extent of systemic involvement," Dr. Williams replied. "But based on the visible symptoms and the duration of untreated fractures, I'm ordering immediate IV antibiotics and scheduling emergency surgery for tomorrow morning." Emergency surgery. The phrase felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in medical dramas, not something that could happen to me. But the X-ray evidence was undeniable. My ankle was a disaster that required immediate professional intervention. "Dr. Williams?" I said, finding my voice despite the shock. "If I had come in right after the injury happened, would surgery have been necessary?" His pause, before answering, told me everything I needed to know. "Probably not," he said carefully. "With immediate immobilization and proper treatment, these fractures likely would have healed without surgical intervention. The displacement and infection are both consequences of continued weight-bearing on untreated fractures." The weight of that revelation was crushing. Every step I had taken for the past 10 days, every painful journey to school and work, every moment of agony I had endured while trying to prove my toughness, all of it had been making my injury worse. The very thing I thought demonstrated strength had actually been an act of self-destruction. "I need to ask," Dr. Williams said gently, "why you waited so long to seek treatment. 10 days is an unusually long delay for an injury of this severity." The question I had been dreading finally arrived. "How do you explain to a medical professional that your family had convinced you that seeking health care was a sign of weakness? How do you admit that you had been so desperate to avoid being seen as a quitter that you had nearly crippled yourself?" "My family thought it was just a sprain," I said finally. "They said I should walk it off, that going to the doctor would be giving up." Dr. Williams's expression shifted to something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Miss Wilson, whoever told you to walk off 3 fractures gave you dangerously irresponsible advice. This kind of delay in treatment could have permanent consequences for your mobility and quality of life." The condemnation in his voice was gentle but unmistakable. My family's medical judgment hadn't just been wrong, it had been dangerously wrong, the kind of wrong that could result in permanent disability or worse. "What kind of permanent consequences?" Marcus asked, voicing the question I was too afraid to pose myself. Dr. Williams set down the tablet and looked directly at both of us. "Even with surgical repair, there may be long-term issues with joint mobility, chronic pain, and increased risk of arthritis. The infection complicates everything and may require extended antibiotic treatment. In worst-case scenarios, if the infection doesn't respond to treatment, we might be looking at partial amputation." Amputation. The word hit me like a lightning bolt, short-circuiting every rational thought in my head. The possibility that my determination to avoid appearing weak might result in losing part of my leg was so horrifically ironic that I couldn't process it. "We're not there yet," Dr. Williams said quickly, obviously seeing the panic in my expression. "But I want you to understand the seriousness of the situation. This is why we're moving aggressively with both surgery and antibiotic treatment." Dr. Williams left to arrange for my admission and prepare for surgery. Marcus and I sat in stunned silence. The magnitude of what we had learned was almost too large to comprehend. 3 fractures, bone infection, emergency surgery, possible amputation. None of this had been in our worst-case scenario planning. "We have to call Mom and Dad," Marcus said finally. "They need to know what's happening." The thought of facing our parents with this news filled me with dread that was almost worse than the physical pain. Dad's reaction to learning that his walk it off advice had nearly resulted in amputation was going to be devastating, not because he would feel guilty, but because he would find some way to blame me for not being tough enough to heal properly. "What if they're angry that we came here without permission?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. Marcus looked at me with an expression of disbelief. "Stephanie, you almost lost your leg because of their advice. If they're angry about anything, it should be at themselves for not taking you seriously in the first place." But even as he said it, we both knew that wasn't how the conversation would go. Dad didn't admit mistakes, especially not mistakes that challenged his fundamental beliefs about toughness and self-reliance. Somehow, this would become my fault, for not healing fast enough, for not being strong enough to overcome 3 fractures through willpower alone. As the hospital staff prepared for my admission and emergency surgery, I realized that the X-ray images had revealed more than just bone damage. They had exposed the terrible cost of a family culture that valued appearing tough over actual health and safety. The 3 fractures in my ankle were just the visible evidence of a much deeper break in the foundation of trust and care that should have existed between my family and me. The surgery would repair my bones, and the antibiotics would fight the infection. But the damage to my relationship with my family, and my understanding of what it meant to be strong, was going to take much longer to heal. The phone call home at 2:47 a.m. was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Marcus had volunteered to make the call, but I knew this was something I had to do myself. Lying in the hospital bed with IV antibiotics flowing into my arm and surgical consent forms spread across my lap, I dialed our home number with trembling fingers. Dad answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately shifting to alarm when he heard it was me calling from a hospital. "Stephanie? What the hell is going on? Where are you?" "I'm at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital." "Dad, I need to tell you something about my ankle." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried a tone I had never heard before, something that sounded almost like fear. "Your ankle? The one you hurt last week? What about it?" "It wasn't a sprain, Dad. The X-rays show 3 fractures. I need emergency surgery in the morning, and I have a bone infection that the doctors say could have been life-threatening if I had waited any longer." Another long silence, followed by the sound of Mom's voice in the background asking what was wrong. I could hear Dad explaining the situation in muffled tones, then Mom's sharp intake of breath when she understood the severity of what had been happening under their own roof. 3 fractures? Dad's voice had changed completely, losing all its usual authority and confidence. But you were walking on it. You went to work, you went to school. How could you have 3 broken bones and still be walking? The question revealed everything about how fundamentally he had misunderstood the situation. In Dad's worldview, serious injuries were incompatible with continued function. The idea that someone could have multiple fractures and still force themselves to walk was outside his frame of reference. The doctor said that walking on it for 10 days made everything worse, I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. He said if I had gotten treatment right away, I probably wouldn't have needed surgery. The accusation was implicit, but unmistakable. Dad's advice to walk it off hadn't just been wrong. It had been dangerously, catastrophically wrong. And now we all had to live with the consequences of that misjudgment. "We're coming to the hospital," Mom's voice came through the phone, having taken it from Dad. "Right now. Don't sign anything until we get there." Within an hour, my entire family had assembled in my hospital room, creating a scene that felt like a bizarre parody of a family gathering. Dad stood in the corner, staring at the X-ray images that Dr. Williams had left on the computer screen. Mom sat in the visitor's chair, alternating between fussing over my IV line and wringing her hands with nervous energy. Marcus positioned himself near the door, as if ready to flee if the conversation became too intense. But it was Jessica's presence that surprised me most. She had apparently heard the commotion of everyone leaving and had insisted on coming along, despite not being technically family. Her social work training had kicked in the moment she saw the X-rays, and she was asking the kinds of informed questions that my parents seemed incapable of formulating. "How long will the surgery take?" she asked Dr. Williams when he returned, to check on my preoperative preparation. "Approximately 3 to 4 hours, he replied. "We need to realign the displaced bone fragments, insert surgical hardware to stabilize the fractures, and debride any infected tissue. It's a complex procedure, but necessary to save the joint function." Dad finally found his voice. "Doctor, my daughter was walking on this ankle for over a week. If it was really broken, how was that possible?" Dr. Williams turned to face Dad directly, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Wilson, it's not uncommon for people to continue functioning with serious injuries, especially when they're motivated by fear, necessity, or external pressure to appear normal. Pain tolerance varies greatly between individuals, and adrenaline can mask the severity of injuries for extended periods." "But I told her it was just a sprain," Dad said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "She was moving around, going to work, acting like it wasn't that serious." "Based on what I'm seeing in these X-rays," Dr. Williams replied, his tone becoming noticeably cooler, "your daughter was in excruciating pain for the past 10 days. The fact that she continued with normal activities despite 3 fractures and a developing bone infection speaks to remarkable determination, and possibly to feeling like she had no other choice." The implied criticism in Dr. Williams' words was gentle but unmistakable. Dad's face flushed red, the way it always did when someone challenged his authority or judgment. But for once, he seemed at a loss for words, unable to mount his usual aggressive defense. Mom finally spoke up, her voice small and uncertain. "We didn't know. If we had known it was really broken, we would have brought her in right away." "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Williams said carefully, "the signs of serious injury were apparent from the beginning. Severe swelling, obvious pain, inability to bear weight normally. These are all indicators that warrant immediate medical evaluation, regardless of what the underlying injury might be." The condemnation was diplomatically phrased, but its meaning was clear. Any reasonable person should have recognized that this injury required professional attention. My parents had failed in their most basic responsibility to ensure my health and safety. Jessica stepped forward, her social work instincts taking over. "Dr. Williams, what kind of support will Stephanie need during recovery? How long before she can return to normal activities?" Recovery will be extensive, he replied. 6 to 8 weeks in a cast, followed by several months of physical therapy. Even then, there may be permanent limitations in joint mobility and increased risk of future complications. The infection complicates everything and may require ongoing monitoring. The full scope of what my family's negligence had cost me was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just going to be a few weeks of inconvenience. This was going to affect the rest of my life. My career plans in nursing, my ability to stay physically active, my long-term health prospects, all of it had been compromised by 10 days of trying to prove I was tough enough to meet Dad's impossible standards. As Dr. Williams left to finalize surgical preparations, the family fell into an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "Stephanie, I didn't know it was this serious. If I had seen those x-rays." "But you didn't want to see x-rays," I interrupted, finding a strength in my voice that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. "You made the decision without any medical knowledge, without examining my ankle properly, without even considering that you might be wrong." Dad's face crumpled in a way I had never seen before. For the first time in my life, my father looked genuinely uncertain, genuinely fallible. "I thought I was teaching you to be strong. I thought. You thought being strong meant ignoring serious medical problems," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You thought admitting I needed help was the same as giving up? But look where that got us." The confrontation felt like a dam bursting after years of accumulated pressure. All the times Dad had dismissed my concerns, all the moments when his rigid ideas about toughness had overridden basic compassion and common sense, all the ways his need to be right had endangered the people he claimed to love. "I almost lost my leg because you were more concerned with me not appearing weak than with me actually being healthy," I continued. "That's not strength, Dad. That's just pride and stubbornness." Marcus stepped forward, adding his voice to mine. "Dad, Stephanie could have died from that infection. The doctor said it could have spread to her bloodstream, all because you wouldn't let her see a doctor for what you decided was a minor injury." The weight of their children's unified criticism seemed to physically diminish Dad. He sat down heavily in the remaining chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of defeat. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words coming out like they were being torn from his throat. "I was completely, terribly wrong, and I'm sorry." It was the first time I had ever heard my father admit to being wrong about anything, let alone apologize for it. The moment felt momentous, like a fundamental shift in the family dynamic that had governed our relationships for decades. Mom was crying quietly, probably realizing that her own passive acceptance of Dad's judgment had contributed to my suffering. "Honey, we should have listened to you. We should have taken you seriously." As the surgical team arrived to prepare me for the operating room, I felt something shift inside me that was more significant than any physical healing. For the first time in my life, I had stood up to my father's expectations and won. I had advocated for my own health and safety, even when it meant admitting that I needed help. The surgery would repair my ankle, and the antibiotics would fight the infection. But the real healing, the restoration of my ability to trust my own judgment and advocate for my own needs, had already begun. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I looked back at my family gathered in the doorway. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization of how close their stubborn pride had come to causing irreparable harm. But they also looked like they were finally ready to learn what real strength actually meant. The anesthesia mask descended over my face, and my last conscious thought was that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. And that lesson had nearly cost me everything to learn. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.